Hello! Today we are talking about newspapers and agenda setting theory. Dot dot dot. And we'll talk also about whether there's bias in the news, and if so, what kind, and what should we do about it? And if there isn't, then, well, I guess the lecture will be shorter. Let's get started. We're going to begin with agenda setting theory, which is a theory about, well, who gets to decide what the news is about and what it's covering. So first, I want you to think about what is some news that has happened in the past week, and how did you find out about it? So first, what is some news that happened in the past week, and then how did you find out? So here is one premise of agenda setting theory. News directs our attention. We judge as important what the media judge as important. That is, things that are covered a lot by the news eventually become important to the public. Even if at the beginning you don't really think of the thing as important, if it keeps being in your news feeds over and over and over and all the time, if a lot of people are talking about a thing, eventually you may start to think the thing is important too, and you may start to pay attention to the thing. So even if something is not intrinsically important to you, if a lot of people are talking about it as news and a lot of places are treating it as news, you may come to see it as news as well. News also engages in framing. You cannot, when you're reporting about something or telling a story, tell every single detail of that story because you just don't have time. You can't tell exactly what every part of it smelled like or exactly every detail of what you saw. What are you going to tell me about? I was standing next to a pine tree and pine needle 1 looked like this, and pine needle 2 looked like this, and pine needle 3 looked like this, and pine needle 4 looked like this, and pine needle 5 looked like this. Nobody would want you to do that. You wouldn't want you to do that, and probably you didn't look at every single pine needle anyway, and so you couldn't, right? You have to select what you're going to share. We hope you're going to tell us just the relevant details, right? I don't know if you've seen the film Ant-Man, but there is a recurring bit where Ant-Man is talking with his friend, and his friend will go off on these completely irrelevant details all the time. And he'll be like, stop, stop, stop. Focus. Tell me what I need to know, right? And this is selection. It's choosing which parts to share. It's trying to figure out what are the relevant details and telling that part of the story, right? And people who work in news need to do this. They also need to choose an emphasis. They have to choose what to focus on. Not only do they need to choose what the relevant parts are, they need to choose what the most important parts are, what to emphasize, what not to emphasize, what to spend more time on, what to spend less time on, what to detail, what not to detail, what to go through quickly, what to go through slowly, right? So you're not only selecting, you're also emphasizing. And this is an important part of storytelling. This is an important part of paper writing. This is an important part of drawing. This is an important part of music, right? This is an important part of how we communicate with each other. And it's an important part of news. You'll also have to choose exclusion, what not to say. Don't tell me about every single pine needle I don't want to know, right? And exclusion doesn't mean that I'm lying to you. It could, if I'm purposely not telling you an important part that I know you want to know. But it also could mean I'm not telling you about the 107th pine needle because you don't want to know it and it's not important. But I have to make that judgment call, right? And sometimes I make the wrong one. Sometimes the pine needles turn out to be the most important part. And so then I did it wrong. But you have to, like, part of learning how to be a journalist is learning which things are the important things and which things aren't. Which things to select, which things to emphasize, which things to exclude. That is the job of a journalist, is to learn how to do that. That is why it's hard to be a journalist, is that you yourself have to do those things, but you also have to know when somebody else is doing them and which ones they're doing, because that impacts how you're able to tell the story and what story you're telling. And then you also have to choose what things to explain further and which things you think people will already understand. You probably don't have to tell me what a dog is if there's a dog in the story. However, if there's a bear cat in the story and it's not around here, you might have to tell me what that is. Because what's a bear cat? How about an owl bear? Well, in some groups of people, you don't have to explain what an owl bear is, but in some groups you do. And so you have to be able to judge whether you need to stop and explain what an owl bear is, or a bear cat. Or if you can just keep going because that group will know what that is, right? So you have to know when you need to explain something and when you can just keep going. And that's called elaboration. So making these 4 kinds of choices is altogether is what's called framing. Framing isn't lying necessarily. I mean, it could be, but framing is choosing what goes in the story and what doesn't. You can never tell everything. That's one of the reasons that it's important to get multiple points of view on the same thing, right? It's one of the reasons that it's helpful to be able to read more than one account of the same story, or to listen to, or to see. But it's not necessarily that somebody's trying to trick you. You just can't include everything. And so what is said and what is not said, what is shared and not shared, what is focused on and not focused on, doesn't necessarily mean that there is bias there. It just means that this is how human communication works. Whether a journalist is skilled or not, whether they're good at telling a story or not, often depends heavily on how good they are at making these choices. And those things have nothing to do with whether or not they're biased as journalists. They have to do with the limits of human communication. Now, here is the central tenet of agenda setting theory. The media may not only tell us what to think about, they also tell us how and what to think about it, and perhaps even what to do about it. So here's where we get this idea that maybe the media is trying to trick us. And this is because newspapers are trying to get us to buy them. I've put in a link to this slide, an interesting TED Talk about newspaper headlines that I think you might enjoy if you have a little bit of time. So you can check that out if you want to. I didn't pick the Miami Herald in particular for any particular reason here, but they don't have any particularly more shocking headlines than anybody else. They just have a good example of shocking headlines. So this theory was created when people had to read the newspaper or watch a news show to get the news, and there wasn't really any other way to find things out other than talking to people directly, right? So I do want you to consider that as we move forward, and whether you think it's still true now, and why or why not that, like, its specific moment in time that it was made up might be affecting it. All right, let's talk about newspapers, though, specifically within this theory, and also newspapers themselves. So continuing with this idea of like whether news and newspapers specifically have bias in them and whether we can trust them. So here are some factors that influence news. News organizations are businesses. They're not nonprofits. They have to sell you the content. We don't have, paper children standing on the street corners saying, "Get your paper, extra, extra, read all about it," right? In most places, we don't even have children going door to door or like going up and down the street with their bicycle throwing newspapers. Some places, I guess that still happens, but mostly it happens in cars. But we still have to sell you the content. There still has to be a reason for you to click on the thing, right? And so what makes you want to click on things? What makes you want to buy that news? Well, there's a famous saying, if it bleeds, it leads. News that is more sensational is more, gets more attention. And so newspapers have a strong reason to want to have sensational things on the front cover. And now, because there's not even front covers, now they're just having individual articles. So now they have to have every headline be sensational. And so now everything has to be sensational or shocking or extreme. And so even if the story isn't sensational, even if the story is useful information, the headline still has to be. That's where we're at with our news right now. And that makes it seem more biased than it sometimes is. The second thing is that news is reported by a variety of people. And each of these people has their own training. And so they're going to be better or worse at those things we just talked about in terms of framing. Their own expertise. So they're going to know more or less about different aspects of society and culture. And access to networks of people, to places, to just like cultural knowledge. And their own bias. So yeah, there's bias in news because news is made by people. And guess what? People have biases. All of us, every single one. That doesn't mean that no news is to be trusted. Just like it doesn't mean that no person is to be trusted. It just means that you gotta take it with a small grain of salt, but like a little one, not like a mountain. Because news reporters are trying to be fair in a way that most of our communication, frankly, isn't. When you're talking to your friend, they're not necessarily trying to be fair. They're not thinking about codes of ethics when they're talking to you. They're being your friend. They probably are trying not to hurt you, but they're not necessarily trying to tell you a just story either, right? And so we have this kind of trying to counterbalance out people's own inherent biases. And we have people will say, oh, this news station has this political bias, or that news station has that political bias. Here's the deal. So, research shows the news station that in the news programming that has the least amount of political bias is Fox News. In the news programming. Problem is, Fox News Channel doesn't run very much news programming. It runs mostly opinion programming. And because it's on the Fox News Channel, people get confused because they turn on the news channel and they think that everything on there is news and most of it's opinion. The opinion programming is heavily biased, as it is on all networks. That's the point of it. It's opinion. So people get confused about that. The actual news reporting is not very biased. CNN's news reporting is pretty biased. MSNBC's news reporting is very biased. Well, not very biased. None of these are very biased. MSNBC's was the strongest. CNN's was fairly middling. And Fox News was the most neutral when this study was run, which now was over 10 years ago. But opinion programs are not the same as news programs. And so you can't say Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow are not biased. They're so biased. That is their whole job, is to be biased. They're not trying to be fair. They're trying to make people get riled up. That's their job. So it's important to kind of sort out. People say Fox News and they mean Sean Hannity. That's not the same as the actual nightly news programming, right? Okay, so news has to try to get your attention. They have to try to sell you stuff, and that matters a lot to how our news system works. And also it's made out of people. And people turn out to not be robots, although we'll talk about robots later. All right, so continuing on this idea of the news being objective, we have this ideal of a free and independent press dedicated to finding and telling the truth, right? In the US, we have the press guaranteed freedom and independence from government oversight, right? This is the First Amendment. It's very important to us. In other countries, the government runs the media, and so you don't ever really know what is going on in terms of the government, because the government is the one telling you what is happening, and maybe they're lying to you about what they're doing. Yeah, and you don't know. But we do have this thing where our press relies on the advertising. So if it leads, right? And we have all this sensationalism. And so we end up having our news coverage and our media skewing towards sensationalism. And so our press is driven by profit in a way that the press isn't in other places, but it's not controlled by the government. And so we have a different kind of issue that we have to worry about in the US in terms of keeping an eye on our press and making sure it's doing its job the way that we hope it is. All right, I do want to take a moment and talk about the black press because I think that it offers an interesting counterpoint to this problem. This chart comes from the Black Press Research Collective. And this chart is of the yellow dots are the Baltimore Afro-American, the red is the Chicago Defender, and the blue is the Pittsburgh Courier. So these are from the circulation weekly of these 3 different newspapers. And African Americans created these newspapers, among others. There are hundreds of black newspapers, but these were ones that circulated nationally. So these are like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post. These are ones that got delivered all around the country. And these were created starting in the mid-1800s. Black newspapers started to be created and circulated in response to biased reporting about racial issues. So things would happen like the Tulsa massacre, where the United States government and U.S. citizens went into the black part of town and just burned everything down. Just set everything on fire, killed a bunch of people, and burned everything down because they didn't like that black people lived there. And this was covered in the newspapers as a race riot. And so black people were like, clearly we can't really trust the newspapers to tell people what is happening. And so they made their own newspapers to cover those sorts of events and to exchange clear and accurate information between people, to share what was going on. And many of these newspapers still exist. The Pittsburgh Courier is still in existence. And I have put a couple of links to more information about some of these newspapers in our on the page for today if you are interested in learning more about them. So the reason that I wanted us to talk about the black press in particular is because they raise an interesting issue about objectivity and injustice. And recently, Dr. Kim Gallen, who is a scholar of the black press and digital humanities and is a professor at Purdue University, wrote an article for Medium about what the mainstream news media can learn from the history of the black press. And I'm going to read you 3 quotes from this and then give you an assignment to kind of think about what we maybe can learn from the approach that the black press took when when there were some questions of injustice and justice. So she says, the pursuit of objectivity reinforced dominant power structures and cultural attitudes, all of which contributed to the racial oppression of African Americans. And she's talking here about the time period during the Jim Crow laws and racial segregation. During the time when white newspapers were saying things like a bunch of white people went and murdered a bunch of black people, and then they called it a race riot. Objectivity, balance, and neutrality on their own do not work in challenging a political establishment that runs on dishonesty and corruption. The history of the Black press reveals that speaking truth to power requires a more complex approach that depends on a commitment to not only routing out lies, but also combating injustice. So Dr. Gallen's claim here is that if you're covering issues where people are dishonest and corrupt, just being objective about it isn't going to make that corruption or dishonesty go away, because you aren't saying that the situation is dishonest or corrupt. You're just saying that it is, that it exists, right? And what you have to do is take a stand, or you have to fight against it. And if you don't do that, nothing's going to change. If you just stay neutral, nothing will change, because the person doing bad will keep doing bad, and that will make the world worse, right? That if you stay the same, if you stay neutral at times when someone's doing wrong, the wrongdoing will continue. The Black press's legacy offers mainstream news media a path forward. A path forward in covering Trump and future presidential administrations. It presents them with opportunities to be unapologetic advocates for democracy and truth, things the United States needs most at this moment. So she's arguing that we are in a similar enough situation that we need to think about taking this approach, that we, in this time, we need to think about advocating for democracy and truth, and that we should think about amending or changing the way that journalists go about their jobs. So I want you to think about this. Basically, Dr. Gallen's claim is that objectivity in news reporting is necessary but not enough. Insufficient, not enough to fight injustice. That objectivity is good when things are going fine, but by itself, it doesn't do enough to fight injustice. So what I am going to have you do is I have put in our folder for the week the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. Is just one page. And I want you to particularly think about how this Code of Ethics instructs reporters to cover injustice and what to do about issues of injustice. So read this Code of Ethics and pay attention to how it instructs reporters to cover injustice. And then I have put the Black Press Credo also in our folder for this week. And And it is this Black Press credo that Dr. Gallen is referring to in her article. I want you to read it, remembering that it is a response to white journalists calling the burning down of entire towns, black towns, race riots. And remember, it's white people burning down black towns, and those are being called race riots. So I want you to read the Black Press credo. And then I want you to think about Dr. Gallen's argument that the response we need to a crisis over fake news, the issue of not knowing whether or not we can trust things, the problem of clickbait articles, is the answer the Black Press credo? Should we be fighting injustice in this way? Do you agree? Do you disagree with Dr. Gallen? Why or why not? What do you think would happen if we take Dr. Gallen's advice? This is your engagement activity for today. You don't have a quiz. I want you to read these 2 codes of ethics, think about them, and then in any format you like, you can write it, you can make a short video, you can, which you can record directly in the assignment. You can do an auditory recording. But think about these questions and respond, turn it in at the engagement activity assignment. Okay. You don't have to turn this in anywhere this week, but I do want you to think through briefly whether newspapers are a mass media platform. Do they meet the 3 criteria from our book? The message is sent via a mass communication system. The message is delivered rapidly. The message reaches large groups of different kinds of people simultaneously or within a very short period of time. And then whether newspapers are a mass media industry according to the textbook definition. The mass media are profit-centered. Technology developments change the way mass media are delivered and consumed. Mass media reflect and affect politics, society, and culture. Finally, you should add a new column to your table about different forms of media. What kinds of communication do newspapers help people do well? What kinds are they not good for, etc., etc. Fill in your answers to these questions. You should have all these questions already in your table, so fill in your answers to the ones about newspapers specifically. Add a column for newspapers. And then finally, I want you to begin to think about the future of newspapers. The current model of newspapers is a mixture of print and online format, paywalled, which means you have to pay to get access, and open access, which means you don't have to pay to get access. We don't have time to go through these questions today. These same questions will come up with future forms of media, but you can begin to think about them. What value do newspapers provide? What strengths do they have? What challenges do they face? And what do you think they should do to continue to survive as a form of media? All right, so we're adding the last piece of your data viz format today. After this, I will just say do a data viz and you will know how to do them because we are adding the last part of how to do them today. So you're going to be making a data viz of your news consumption, how you'll get your news, and you can do that like we did it for paper last week. And write a short paragraph about what you learned about your news consumption through tracking it and making the data viz. This can be something interesting you found out, something you found surprising, something you expected to happen and it didn't, something you expected to happen and it did. If it went just about the way you would expect, then you can write about that and why. It should be somewhere between 100 and 250 words, okay? So it's a short paragraph. You know, the kind of thing that would fit on one side of an index card, about that long, with, you know, kind of normal handwriting. Like this-ish. All right. So you're going to turn that in along with your data visualization and the key so that I can understand your data visualization. All right? You're turning in the data visualization and your paragraph. Cell phone videos of the drawings are fine. On Schoology, at the assignment, Media Tracking 2, News. Okay? So we're just adding a short little paragraph here. Okay, so as a reminder, here's your homework. There are 4 things. They're all little. 1, do the engagement assignment, newspapers, which is just answering that reflection about the 2 different codes of ethics. 2, media tracking 2 about not newspapers but news, where you get your news. I don't know why I wrote newspapers. It's news. 3, read chapter 4 of the textbook about magazines. That's before next class. And 4, have a great day. I hope you take care. I'll see you next time.